Good evening, everybody. Let's start by generating our motivation and thinking of our human potential, the capacity that we all have to generate a heart of loving kindness that is impartial and extends towards all sentient beings. The ability we have to realize the nature of reality and to merge our mind with it single-pointedly. And through cultivating our mind in this way, gaining various abilities and powers that enable us to benefit others very effectively. And so wanting to do this out of compassion, out of love for others, and so therefore generating the altruistic intention for full enlightenment. So let's make that our long-term goal. And as one part of doing that, to listen to the teachings this evening. So take a moment and cultivate that motivation. Okay. So we've been working with this mind training like rays of the sun for quite a while now, and it talks about the path to enlightenment, and specifically what's called the two bodhicittas. The first one being the altruistic intention to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings, and the second one being the wisdom that directly realizes the nature of reality. And so we're on the section of the book now that's talking about how to cultivate that wisdom. It's a very technical topic. It requires a lot of focus and review and diligent studying. So when you're listening to these teachings, you have to be willing to review your notes, review the topic in between one session or the other. Otherwise, it's going to be hard for you to follow. So last weekend when I was in Coeur d'Alene, somebody was asking me some questions about last week's teaching, so I thought it might be good to do a little bit of a review of it, because we were getting into some of the terminology and so on. But to really emphasize to people that it's going to take some effort on your part to really benefit and understand these teachings. It's not just a question of tuning in every Thursday night and seeing what's new. Okay, you have to put in some work during the week to learn the material and to think about it. It's interesting, in our American school system, one of the only ways you get people to learn is to test them, and yet we all hate tests. And I found it always very peculiar, that when you leave people, they come and they really want to learn the material, but then when you teach, they seem to stop wanting to learn. They maybe want you to, pour it in, kind of, or do something without exerting much effort. But as we all know, to learn anything, we need to practice it and, put out some energy. And then according to the energy we put out, then the results correspond to that. Okay, so just a little bit of a review. We started talking last week about some of the positions of the various tenet schools. Okay, so within Buddhism, there's different philosophical tenet systems because the Buddha taught different audiences at different times, and different people had different levels of interest, different kinds of predisposition, different capabilities, different tendencies and preferences. So he taught different things according to the audience. And so out of this, different people developed different philosophical tenet systems. And these existed in ancient India, and then, of course, when Buddhism went to Tibet, they came into Tibet. I think the Tibetans kind of made these systems a little bit more like official schools. I think in ancient India, there were different people, and they all kind of talked together and debated together, and within one monastery you found people having a whole bunch of different ideas. And then in Tibet, I think they took some of these systems that existed in India and used them as a pedagogical tool for teaching us how to think about the nature of reality, and for starting with views that were more in common with how we ordinarily see things, and then slowly refining the view and deepening the view. Okay, and so therefore we say that there's some kind of lower schools and some higher schools, or you could say grosser systems, more refined systems, something like that. Now, the four systems, I use this, used to usually using these Sanskrit terms for these. So the first one is Vaibhasika, and the second is Sautantrika. The third is Chittamadra, or mind only in English. And the fourth one is Madhyamaka. And the Madhyamakas many of these schools have different sub-branches, but when we look at the Madhyamaka, we're just going to look at the Svatantrika Madhyamakas and the Prasangika Madhyamakas. Okay, now when you talk about these, sometimes the first two, the Vaibhasikas and Sautantrikas, are called systems of the fundamental vehicle, and then the Chittamadras and the Madhyamakas, Madhyamaka means middle way, that those are called the Mahayana systems. So it's important to understand here what that means, okay? Because when we think of fundamental vehicle, we often think of people who are aiming towards arhatship, or their own liberation. And when we think of the Mahayana, or the universal vehicle, the great vehicle, we're thinking of people who have the motivation for full enlightenment. Okay, so then you wonder, well, what does that have to do with your philosophical tenets? So there's two ways to either be of the fundamental vehicle or the Mahayana. Okay, so one way is in terms of your motivation, whether you're seeking liberation for yourself, which puts you in the fundamental vehicle, or if you're seeking enlightenment for the benefit of all being, which puts you into the Mahayana vehicle. And all this categorization is according to the Tibetan system. Not all the Buddhist traditions agree on this. But then, so that's just a way of dividing into fundamental and Mahayana according to your motivation. Then there's another way of dividing people into these two classifications that has to do with your philosophical tenets. Okay? In other words, what you believe philosophically, how you think things exist, what do you think the path is. And so when you divide that way, you have Vaibhasika and Sautantrika being the fundamental vehicle, tenet systems, and the Chittamadra and Madhyamaka being the Mahayana tenet systems. Okay? Now, you may wonder, well, what about the Theravada tradition? You know, this is a huge tradition that's existing today in many countries. They are not included in this classification because in the early days of Buddhism, you know, after just a few centuries, Buddhism went to Sri Lanka, about the 3rd century BC, and they developed their own systems there. Okay, whereas all these different systems I'm talking about, these 4 principal systems, mostly developed in northern India, quite a distance away from Sri Lanka. So when you look at the Theravada system, some of their tenets are in common with various of the different 4 schools, but you can't pinpoint them into any one of them because they were off in Sri Lanka when these 4 were developing in North India. Okay? So somebody could have a fundamental vehicle motivation wanting to attain liberation for themselves. Okay, so it would be fundamental vehicle in terms of their motivation, but they may be Mahayana in terms of their philosophical tenet systems. Okay, following, let's say, the middle way or the Chittamatra. Or somebody might be fundamental vehicle in terms of both their motivation and their philosophical tenets. Or somebody might be Mahayana, both in terms of their motivation, wanting full enlightenment, and in terms of their tenets, following, you know, the Chittamatras or Madhyamakas. Or somebody might be Mahayana in terms of motivation, wanting full enlightenment, but their view on reality is according to the Vaibhasikas or Sautantrikas. Okay? So the Tibetans have this thing that they call it Muji. It means 4 points. So it's whenever you take 2 things, how do you, see how they fit together? So you do it in these 4 ways that I just described. Is there something that can be both A and A on both sides, both A on one side, B on the other side, both B on this side and A on this side, and both B on both sides, okay? So we have all 4 possibilities in these 2 in terms of being fundamental vehicle according to and Mahayana according to motivation and according to tenet system. Okay? So when we study the tenets in the Tibetan system, like I said, we usually start with the tenet systems that correspond more to our ordinary way of thinking, and then we get to a more and more refined position. The school that's considered the most refined, or the highest position, is called the Prasangika Madhyamaka. Okay? And so very often in the West, teachers will teach that view because they don't assume that people who have busy lives are going to sit down and study all the philosophical tenet systems. So they just teach that one and hope to plant some seeds, and then maybe, at another time you'll become more interested in these. However, some people do want to go into the systems in more depth, and the advantage of doing that is that when you do study the Prasangika Madhyamaka view, you understand it much better. Okay, because it refutes some of the other views held by the lower systems, and so you have more of that perspective of what they're actually saying, and so that's why it's beneficial to study these different systems. Okay. So, we were last week going through the different systems in terms of what they say the self is, and the self-grasping, and selflessness. Okay. Now, the word self, and this is something that's important, please try and remember it. The word self can mean different things in different contexts. Okay. So one way of talking about self, it means person. okay? I'm a self, you're a self. Self means person. Another way of talking about self is that it is the false way of existing that is actually what we are refuting or negating when we're learning all these different tenet systems. Okay? So when we talk about the self of persons, there we're talking about the kind of person, that we've elaborated that doesn't really exist, that we're trying to see with wisdom does not exist. And the different schools have different ideas of exactly what that self of persons is. There's also a self of phenomena, which is meaning mostly other phenomena aside from the self. That's in general. Here it often refers to the aggregates, the body and mind, which are the basis of designation of the person. And so you have also the self of phenomena, which is again the wrong way of existing that we've projected onto phenomena. And again, the different tenet systems have different ideas about what these are. So last week we put up a little thing on the internet so that people could print out a handout. So this is what I was talking about. People have to do a little bit of work to able to understand the teachings. So we went through it last week, and I want to review it again this week, okay? And just to say for people that there's new terminology here, and it's not this isn't your ordinary language that you use when you go into work, because you're not talking about the latest TV program or the new movie on the cinema or the ridiculous things that I won't say which party is doing in the Congress. Maybe you can guess. But we're not talking about those kinds of things. So the language is a little bit different. You have to learn a new vocabulary. It's like, many of you have different careers, and you have a special vocabulary for your career, don't you? So this is kind of the vocabulary you use for learning Buddhist philosophy. So it takes some time to learn these terms, and then to also learn the concepts that these terms refer to. Yeah, and so in terms of learning the Dharma is taught in a very different way than we learn things in secular school. Because in secular school, a regular school, the idea of learning something means you memorize it so you can tell it to the teacher who already knows what it is. You tell the teacher something that they already know. And if you can do that well, then you get a good grade. Right? Okay? And so we just attempt to memorize things and, kind of tell people what they already know. And then we think we know something and they think we know something. But here in the Dharma, the way we're educated is a little bit different, and there's very much this idea of planting seeds. In other words, you hear something many times, and each time you hear it, it puts an imprint in your mind. It plants a seed. You hear the same word once, and you hear it again, and you hear it again. You slowly begin to understand what it means. You slowly begin to understand these different conceptions. Okay? And so that's what we're doing. So we're not expecting everything to be immediately, instantaneously clear to every single person. Yeah? Because people are at various levels, aren't we? Yeah? And so the idea is that we all learn at our own level, and as we hear the same material many times, sometimes from different perspectives, then we begin to understand it more. Okay? So, if you have your sheet with you, how many people have their sheet? One. Well, even the people that we gave the sheet to at the Abbey don't seem able to bring it with them. what to do. Maybe we should have a memory course on Thursday night. Okay, so if you look at your sheet, the one person in the audience who has, and hopefully the people online who have, and all of you who didn't download it last week, you will see that on your outline about selflessness, okay, that we have different schools listed down the right column, and we have across on the top the core self of persons, the subtle self of persons, the core self of phenomena, and the subtle self of phenomena, okay? And then we look and we see which school asserts which kind of thing as the object of negation. Okay, so this is one term. The object of negation is the self, and here self means the false thing you think exists. You know, it means the self that's being negated. So when we talk about selflessness, it doesn't mean the lack of persons. It means the lack of this object to be negated. In other words, we've realized that this fanciful thing that we've projected doesn't exist. We've seen its lack, its emptiness. That's called the selflessness. Okay? And so the self of persons, self of phenomena, is that wrong self that we think exists. And then the self-grasping of persons, the self-grasping of phenomena, is the mind, it's a consciousness, the mind that is grasping at the existence of that self, thinking that it really truly is reality. Okay. And the reason that this is such a big deal, is not just because we need something to talk about on Thursday nights, but because our grasping at the self of person and self of phenomena, and particularly an inherently existent person and inherently existent phenomena, our grasping at these things is what gives rise to our attachment, anger, jealousy, conceit, confusion, wrong views, okay? All these different incorrect attitudes and disturbing emotions that continuously afflict our mind. And then our mind, when it's under the influence of these various afflictions, we do actions, that's karma, okay? And then those actions have an ethical dimension, and they leave energy traces. You can call them either seeds of karma or having happened, or jigpa, if you like the Tibetan term. They leave these energy traces, you could say, that influence what we're reborn as, what we experience, what environment we're in, and so on. Okay? And so, when we look at our situation and we say, why am I born me, and why does what happens to me happen? Okay? Well, it happens because it's been conditioned by my previous actions, my karma. And where did my karma arise from? From my mental afflictions, at least the negative karma, from greed and attachment and clinging and rebelliousness and rage and, close-mindedness, these kinds of things. And where did all these disturbing emotions come from? Okay, they came from ignorance, from apprehending things in the totally opposite way from how they actually exist. Okay, so ignorance apprehends things completely the opposite way. It's not just being cloudy-minded and unclear, but it's being completely 180 degrees opposite way. So that's what the self-grasping is. It's called self-grasping ignorance. So it's the root of the whole thing. Okay? So when we have situations in our life that are unpleasant, then instead of blaming other people, we need to, look back at what the source of our actual difficulties are, and it's this self-grasping ignorance. And so learning how to generate wisdom and what wisdom apprehends is a big deal, because with that wisdom, when we see that the self-grasping is holding doesn't exist, then that self-grasping can't hold it anymore. Okay? When that self-grasping ignorance is eliminated, then the attachment, the confusion, the closed-mindedness, the jealousy, the conceit, all those things have no basis on which to stand, and they completely disintegrate. And then the karma that causes rebirth in cyclic existence is no longer created, and then liberation comes about. So that's why this topic is important, okay? It's not just a topic for debate and, philosophical discussion and, when you get tired of watching the news on Thursday night. It's something actually of really crucial importance to all of us, okay? So, the Vaibhasika school, the initial school, and the Sautantrika school, they both have their different tenet systems, but regarding, the self that they negate in these four categories, then they're identical. Okay? So according to both these schools, the coarse self of persons is a permanent, partless, independent person. And the subtle self of person is a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And they don't assert, obviously, any, or in a very evident way, a selflessness of phenomena, or that there's a self of phenomena that's negated. The further they go into that is to say a phenomena, or the aggregates, the body and mind, that are possessed by, a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Okay? So now, if we unpack these two things, permanent, partless, independent, and self-sufficient, substantially existent. So permanent, partless, independent person, or permanent, partless, independent self, and their self is referring to person. Okay? We talked about this a few weeks ago, where permanent means that it is eternal and it doesn't change from one lifetime to the next. So forget even momentary change from one moment to the next, from one lifetime to the next. This kind of self or soul doesn't change. So it's the Hindu idea or Indian idea of Atman, and it's very similar to the theistic idea of soul. Okay? Something that is me, that never changes from life to life. So that's permanent. Partless means it's one unitary thing. It doesn't have different parts in any way. It's, and it's independent. And here, independent means it doesn't depend on causes and conditions. So something that depends on causes and conditions is in constant flux. It changes to moment to moment simply because the cause that produced one moment is ceasing and another cause that produces the next moment is arising. Okay? So things that are impermanent are changing moment by moment by moment. Things that are, well, that's true what I said about impermanent. They're changing moment by moment by moment. But here, the things that are produced by causes and conditions are impermanent, because when the cause goes out of existence, then the result does, and a new cause comes and you get a new result. Okay? So things that are dependent on causes and conditions don't stand on their own feet. They're dependent on other factors, in particular their causes. Okay? So a permanent, partless, independent independent self is one that's eternal, it's unitary, and it doesn't depend on anything else. Okay? So that's kind of like the idea of soul that we grew up with, isn't it? You know, there's something that is you, that doesn't change from life to life and goes on eternally, and, you know, doesn't depend on causes and conditions because it's you. Okay? The same idea goes towards a creator. You know, a creator is permanent, a unitary whole, and also didn't arise out of causes and conditions. We talk about a creator, they're just some absolute entity that appeared without causes and conditions. Okay? So when you look at that view, and we talked about that a few weeks ago, so I won't go into too much depth on it now. When we look at that view and we apply reasoning to it, it becomes very difficult to sustain. Okay? Because if we look, what we call the person exists in dependence upon the body and the mind. And the body and mind are changing all the time, aren't they? Yeah? Isn't your body changing all the time? Isn't your mind changing all the time? So if that's the case, then how can the self not change? Okay? And then also, you know, from one life to the next, we have, you know, this life you're Henry, and next life you're Susan, and the next life after that you're, you know, somebody else. And so there's a continuity here, but the self of each life is changing, you know, because the label of that self is changing. You know, you're not, when you're reborn, you're not exactly the same person that you were in your previous life. Just as when you wake up on a new day, you're not exactly the same person you were yesterday. Okay? And so, very clearly, you know, who we are depends on causes and conditions, doesn't it? Yeah? And when causes and conditions change, we change. So, you know, when we look at things that way, we see that holding on to this idea of a permanent, partless, independent self, it becomes very difficult to do when you apply reasoning. Okay, because how can such a thing possibly exist? Yeah? What do you think? Yeah? It gets kind of difficult. Now, granted, emotionally, there can be some comfort in believing that there's a soul. Okay? But we're not talking about emotional comfort. We're talking about reality. The idea being, that if we actually accept reality, then we'll really have emotional comfort, because so much of our fear and our, you know, difficulties come because we reject reality and we fight against it. Okay? So that's permanent, partless, independent one. That one is said, we talk about two levels of self here. One that is acquired, and or two levels of self-grasping, we could say. One that is acquired and one that is innate. So the innate self-grasping goes from one life to the next. You know, cats, grasshoppers, frogs, all the living beings cycling in samsara have this kind of one. Okay? And then there is the acquired level of self-grasping that we get from studying incorrect philosophical tenets. Okay, so for example, if you go somewhere and they teach you, you know, there's a permanent, partless, independent self, and that's who you really are, and you say, oh yeah, that kind of sounds good. Yeah, there's a real soul that's really me and doesn't change, and so I don't need to be afraid of it going out of existence. And you know. And so you acquire that belief. That's called acquired self-grasping. Whereas and it doesn't, you know, necessarily go from life to life, although a tendency for it might do that. It's the innate one that goes from life to life. So this permanent, partless, independent self doesn't have an innate variety. It only has the acquired variety. In other words, we don't come into this life with some kind of grasping at a permanent, partless, independent soul. It's only something that we've learned about. Okay? Whereas when we move into self-sufficient, substantially existent person or inherently existent person or something like that, on those levels there's something that is innate, that we're born with, and something that is acquired that we can learn, you know, and gain from incorrect psychologies or philosophies, or just, you know, even by thinking about things in our own way and coming to the wrong conclusion but thinking it's the right conclusion, which we do all the time, don't we? Okay, so then the course self of persons, yeah, for these schools, is the self-sufficient, substantially existent person. I mean, the subtle one, the self-sufficient, substantially existent. So, what does that one mean? That one means, there's all sorts of different positions about this one too, okay? There's both the acquired form and the innate form, and it's self-sufficient in that it can stand on its own, even though it's related to the aggregates. Okay, so this term aggregates, yeah, we're referring to the 5 psychophysical aggregates that are what the self depends on. So the physical part is the body, and then the mental part, there's 4 of them: feelings, discriminations, conditioning factors, which includes all sorts of emotions and attitudes and views and different things, and then consciousness, which are our 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness, and they perceive the general type of object, whereas the feelings experience the object as painful or pleasurable. The discriminations discern what the object is and identify it, and the conditioning factors, you know, can have all sorts of different reactions to it. Some of the conditioning factors, you know, might be just like attention or intention, you know, and others may be emotional responses or views that we hold. Okay? So these 5 aggregates are the basis of what we call the self or the person. Okay? When you think about it, when you say I, yeah, what are you saying I in relation to? Does it just come out of nowhere? Yeah? When you say I, when you say me, isn't it referring in some way to your body, to your consciousness, to your feelings, to your discriminations, to your emotions? So somehow the whole notion, the concept of me or I or person depends on the body and mind. Okay? So a self-sufficient, substantially existent one, it's self-sufficient, okay, in that it stands on its own. It appears to stand on its own, even though it's related to the aggregates. You know, so somebody that's self-sufficient stands on their own. Okay? So it's this feeling that we have inside of, you know, here I am. I stand on my own, even though I'm related to the aggregates. Okay? And it's substantially existent in that we feel that we can perceive it without apprehending anything else. Okay? So let's look at it this way. Okay? We say that there's two terms, substantially existent and imputedly existent, and they're the opposite. Okay? something that is imputedly existent, and this is the meaning of imputation according to the lower systems. Imputed means that to apprehend it, you have to see something else. So to apprehend a person, you have to apprehend their body, don't you? Or hear the sound of their voice, or maybe telepathically you think of their mind, or even untelepathically you think of somebody's ideas or their emotions. Okay? So that's the meaning of imputed. The person is imputed in the sense that we don't get the idea of a person unless we apprehend their body, speech, and mind in some ways. I mean, we don't look to that blank space over there and say that there's a person there. Well, some people might. But in general, in that blank area over there, we don't say there's a person. How come we can't identify a person there? Because there's no indication of a body, speech, or mind, is there? Okay? So the person is imputed in the sense that to apprehend the person, you see their body coming down the street, you hear their voice, you think of their emotions or their thoughts. Okay? Something that's substantially existent is totally the opposite. You don't have to apprehend anything else to apprehend that object. You just look at it and there it is. Okay? And so according to that school, to those schools, there's many kind of substantially existent objects. You just look at it and there's the green. There it is. You don't have to apprehend anything else to apprehend green. It's just there. Okay, so that's said to be substantially existent. Yeah. So and so these systems say, well, the person is imputedly existent. So then the wrong view of the person is going to think that there's a substantial person there. And here substantial doesn't mean matter, okay? It just means something there that you can apprehend without apprehending something else. Okay? So you can look at the person, because we have this feeling sometimes. Somebody walks in the room and there's George. Yeah, we feel like there's a person coming from that side. We don't kind of see, oh, there's a body, that must be George. We feel there's George. Okay? So a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. So that's very often how we apprehend ourselves, how we apprehend others. Okay? Now, within the self-sufficient, substantially existent person, there's a coarse form and there's a subtle form. Okay? You don't have to remember all of it. Just let it sink in a little bit. Okay? So, in the case of the coarse form, the person and the aggregates are held to be different entities. Okay? Now, this is a term that we come across a lot. One entity, different entities, one nature, different nature. Entity and nature here mean the same thing. Okay? And what being one entity or one nature means is that two things, both of them have to exist for the other one to exist. One can't exist without the other. Okay? Whereas things that are different entities or different natures, one can exist without the other one existing. Okay? So an example of things that are one nature, okay, if you talk about the general classification of impermanent things, and then you talk about the cup, Okay? The cup is one nature with impermanent, in the sense that the cup is a member of the category of impermanent, and without this larger category of impermanent existing, the cup can't exist. So the cup is one nature with impermanent, but impermanent isn't one nature with the cup, because there can be many impermanent things without the cup. Okay? Or when Guy was here and he was teaching the two truths, he was saying that they're one nature, in that one can't exist without the other. Okay? We won't get into that right now. But that's, yeah. So in the course way of self-sufficient, substantially existent, the person and the aggregates are seen as having different natures. Okay? So an example of seeing the person and the aggregates of different natures, when we say, like my body, I get sick so often, and I really wish I could change bodies with somebody who's healthy. Okay? We have that thought, don't we? You know? Or my body's too fat, my body's too thin, it's too short, it's too tall. I wish I had somebody else's body. So when we think like that, that's an example of thinking like, you know, the person is one thing and the body is another thing, and the body's just merchandise. We can exchange it. Okay? Or sometimes we might look at our mind and it has so many afflictions, and we say, I'm fed up with this mind. I want the mind of a Buddha. You know, again, as if, you know, the I is one thing, the mind is another, and we could just go, you know, exchange the mind and get the Buddha's mind. Okay, so seeing them as different things like that. You know, sometimes we talk in that way. Okay. Okay, so this is, according to the Madhyamaka, no, according to the Prasangika actually, this is the object of negation that the lower systems negate when they're negating the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Okay, it's a self that's different from the aggregates. Yeah, but the higher schools, you know, the Prasangikas say that there's actually a more subtle, self-sufficient, substantially existent self, okay, which seems to be one nature with the aggregates. And so here's, in the first, it's easier to use examples. When we talk about the one that is different, where the person and the aggregates are different, the example there is like the shepherd and the sheep. Yeah? There's a self, me, and there's my body and mind, okay? And I control the body and mind, like the shepherd controls the sheep, okay? Shepherd just takes out his, you know, thing and herds them along, and, you know. So we have this feeling like there's a me, and I can control this body and mind. Okay, body, I'm telling you, you know, eat less. Okay, mind, I'm telling you not to be so depressed, you know, to be happy or whatever it is. And we get that idea, okay? So there it's really like the I is a controller, and what's controlled are the aggregates, and they're different natures, okay? But in the subtle, self-sufficient, substantially existent person, okay, they seem to be different, but they're also one nature. And so here the analogy is more like a scout leader and scouts. Okay? Because the scout leader is also a scout. They're not different, but the scout leader has more power than the regular scouts do. Okay, so in the analogy, it's the feeling that the mental consciousness is me, and my mental consciousness is what controls the body and mind and all these different mental factors and things like that. Okay? So it's a slightly different idea of a controller. The first one, the sheep and the shepherd, they're two different things. Okay? The second one, the scout and the head scout, they're related, and yet one is more powerful than the other. Okay? So it's an interesting thing when we look inside of ourselves that we can see sometimes one or the other. We have to look quite closely to identify them because we're not used to looking inside and identifying how is it that I think of myself. Or how is the self appearing to me at this particular time? It's not something they taught us in school, you know. Yeah, so that's why we say, it's innate. It just comes up. I'm angry. There's a huge feeling, of a self, but we never notice it. Because nobody ever taught us to pay attention to how the self, the I, appears to us during our day. Yeah? At most we're taught to pay attention to our emotions. And so, I can identify, I have greed, I can identify anger. Okay? But sometimes even those are hard to identify in our own experience. Aren't they? It's like all of a sudden I'm sitting there yelling at somebody, and how did I get so angry? Well, the anger was actually building up for a long time, but I didn't even notice it. Okay? So here it is, our own experience that we live with day to day, and we're space cases. Isn't it remarkable? It's so remarkable. Our own experience. And we don't even know what it is. And part of the thing is, we're so busy looking at other people and judging, I like, I don't like, I want, I don't want, I'm better, I'm worse, that, we're so preoccupied with that, or we're so preoccupied with, there's some money, how can I get it? There's a job, how can I get that? There's prestige, what about this? We're so busy looking outside of ourselves, and, studying external things. Well, how do political institutions function? How does the government function? How do how does the does it function? What are atoms and molecules? How do you make an engine? Why does the moon go around the earth? We're so busy examining and studying outside things that our own experience, how we appear to ourselves and what our own emotions are like totally hidden objects. Isn't it remarkable? Yeah? And no wonder we're confused. Yeah? If you ever say, why am I so confused? Well, this is why. How are we going to sort through our confusion if we can't even identify what's going on inside? Yeah? So to do that, this is where the mental factor of mindfulness is so important. Yeah, and also an introspective awareness that pays attention to what's going on with this body and mind. Yeah, what's the emotion? What's the attitude? How does the self appear to me? My mother used to say to me, who do you think you are, young lady? And actually, it was a very good question. Yeah. I just never bothered to look. Who do I think I am? I never bothered to look. But she was asking me actually quite a profound question. Okay. So we have to, use our mind to be aware of what's going on inside. Okay. Because the biggest mystery is, not the external world. The biggest mystery is in here. And His Holiness always says our real laboratory is in here. Okay? Okay, so we reviewed a little bit here. Yeah? Are there questions? Yeah.
So, if you go back to the sheep and the shepherd, and the scouts and the scout leader, those are both ideas to be refuted or negated.
Yeah.
So, if we're subduing our mind, what's doing the subduing?
Okay, so if we're subduing our mind, who in the world is doing the subduing? And when we're looking at our mind and saying, oh, I feel angry, who is doing the looking? Yeah? Okay. So this is what we call, okay, and here I'm speaking from the Prasangika view, this is what we call the mere I. Okay, so this is the I that exists by being merely labeled independence upon the body and mind. Okay, it's not something tangible, it's not something we can draw a line around and say this is me. It's just a label that is applied to the aggregates, and so that I, is this general vague thing that you can't pinpoint exactly what it is. Okay? Because when you're saying just I'm angry, yeah, can you find some person that is angry? Yeah? Separate from the body and mind. Okay? Oh, it's just when we use the word I, like I'm meditating, or I'm transforming my mind, or whatever, when we're just saying it in a normal way like that, it just refers to, what exists by being merely labeled independence on the body and mind. Okay? Our difficulty is that we aren't satisfied with that. We think that there's something that is the person. Okay? So I'm meditating. I must be the mental consciousness. Okay? The real essence of me is the mental consciousness. But how can I be the mental consciousness? Because when I say I see, the I that's seeing is not the mental consciousness, is it? But if I were the mental consciousness, that would mean the mental consciousness would have to be seeing. But it doesn't see it. That's the visual consciousness that sees. Okay? So when we try and isolate and find something that is the person, that's where we run into trouble, because we can't find anything. But when we don't analyze, there's just this general amorphous appearance of when we say, I'm walking, or I'm thinking, or whatever it is. Okay? So that I exists, what we call the mere I, the one that's merely labeled, it exists. Our problem is that we aren't content with that, and instead we think that there's either a substantially existent person or an inherently existent person. Okay? So we aren't, satisfied with the self that exists by being labeled. We want something that's really there. The essence of me-ness. Okay? Because again, emotionally speaking, that's very comforting, isn't it? Oh, there's a real me. Yeah, there's a real me. I exist. okay, I don't need to worry about anything. Here I am, this me, and it's just this me-ness. There's something very emotionally comforting about it. Until we start thinking about death, and then we think it's going to go into complete oblivion and never exist at all, and then we freak out. Okay, so you see, holding on to this idea of self may on one level feel good, but it also is the root of all the fear. Because if there is this real concrete self, then, what happens to it at death time? And also, we got to do a lot of work to protect this self, because the self is pretty fragile. People can hurt it, outside things can hurt it. Yeah, this self needs a lot of defending. And we spend a good day of each day defending this self, don't we? Yeah? Somebody even says something very small, put the piece of paper over there. Oh, well, I was just going to do that. Somebody's just saying, put the piece of paper over there. Instantly, I'm getting criticized. They think I'm an ignoramus, that I don't know where to put the piece of paper. Well, it happens to be true, but I'm not going to let them know. Well, I was just going to put it there, And so we get into all this thing of defending the self all the time. Slightest little thing. Yeah? So, we should be careful what we believe in, because it might make us unhappy too. Yeah. Then when we hear people talking in a low voice, oh, they're talking about me. What are they saying about me? I better listen. You remember when you were a kid and your parents talked in a low voice? Yeah. Oh, they must be talking about me. It must be good stuff they're saying. Either they're talking about me or they're talking about something that they don't want me to hear about, which means I really want to hear about it. Okay. But this grasping at the self, it takes a lot of energy to support it, and it takes us off all different sorts of directions, protecting this self, pleasing this self. Yeah, we want everybody to like this self. How are we ever going to get everybody to like us? Impossible, but we don't stop trying. Yeah. Okay, so we're not satisfied with just the mere I. We embellish it, and that's the source of our problems. Yeah.
When you say that there isn't this self, and I keep thinking about how people, say they remember their past lives. So that's like in my mind when I think about it.
Okay, so when we say there isn't a self, how do you account for rebirth and remembering past lives? When we say selfless, or selflessness of person, we're not saying that there's no self whatsoever, because self and selflessness means the wrong kind of the concrete self that we think exists. Okay? So that doesn't exist, but this mere I does exist.
Is it like energy?
No, it's just what is merely labeled. Yeah, and it's hard. You have to sit and contemplate it for a while, because every time we sit and think, I, then automatically it like crystallizes into something, and then we go, no, I is just a label that is put, in relationship to the body and mind. Yeah, but then we go, okay, that sounds good. But there's really a me that's there that's different from the body and mind, isn't there? Okay? So we always go into, kind of grasping at some kind of self-sufficient, substantially existent me that's there. Okay? Yeah? So when we're talking about the mere I, the one that's just labeled, that is unfindable when you analyze and look for it, that one can go from one lifetime to the next. Why? Because it isn't anything concrete. Yeah? A concrete soul cannot go from one lifetime to the next. Yeah? Then you go, why not? Well, remember we were talking about something that, is dependent on causes and conditions. It's changing all the time, so it can't be concrete like that. Yeah, it can't be the same thing in the next lifetime. Okay? So there, in the sense that there's a continuity, for example, one moment of consciousness gives rise to another, to another, to another, yeah, then because there's some kind of continuity, although there's nothing going from one moment to the next, there's nothing findable that is going from one moment to the next, yet there's a continuity. Think about it. If you had something concrete, can it go from one moment to the next? Something concrete cannot change. Yeah? So how can it, are you going to talk about a person at moment A that is exactly the same as the person at moment B? Are you exactly the same as you were when you were 2 years old? Sometimes. Yeah. Usually not. Usually we aren't the same. Okay? Yeah. We're not the same, are we? We've changed since we were 2 years old. Even if we didn't want to change, we changed. But we still say I when we look and we say, oh, there are my baby pictures. We still say I. Or this is when I learned to walk. And yet, that's not the same I as we are now, is it? When we say, there's a picture of me when I learned to walk, is that self exactly the same as the self you are right now? No. But do you use the same word to refer to both of those instances? Yes. So the same thing when we talk about the general I or the mere I that goes from one life to the next, it's not the same, but we use that word in both cases. And so in that way, somebody can say, I remember my previous life. Although the previous life isn't the same person as they are this lifetime. This lifetime is, I don't know, kind of somebody's name, Isabel. Okay, this life is Isabel. And Isabel is remembering what Dieter did last lifetime, saying, I remember when I was Dieter. But there, that I that remembers being Dieter is not Isabel. Okay, and there it's just referring to that general I. Okay? But you can't find that I isn't Dieter and isn't Isabel. Just as the same way when you say, here's me when I learned to walk, and here's me learning to ride a bicycle, and here's me, learning to drive a car. It's three different people. They're not the same person, but we say me in relationship to all of them. And that's a general me, a general I. And that functions on a conventional level when we aren't trying to say what exactly is the I, who exactly am I. Because when we ask that question, then we're trying to search for something findable, and we can't find anything. And that's why we say the selflessness of persons, because we can't find anything that is concretely that person. Okay? Take some time to think about this. Okay, so let's dedicate. So this will be a good thing to contemplate on in your meditations. Okay?